Hello everyone. So we're back for Chapter 8, and now we're going to be going into Modules 8.2 and 8.3. So let's have a look at it. And for 8.2 and 8.3, if you look at your review guide, we're going to be covering 5 different things. So set point theory, best weight loss techniques, what anorexia nervosa is, eating disorder factors, and then Masters and Johnson, what they were known for. So, let's get into it. Shake. Alright, so we're going to talk about hunger and eating first in Module 8.2. And before we even get into more about hunger and eating disorders and all of that, we need to understand how hunger works. And hunger works for the most part through the hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain that lets you know when you're hungry and when you're full. And so obviously if your hypothalamus isn't working properly, it can make you feel more hungry when you shouldn't be feeling hungry, or less hungry when you should be feeling hungry. You won't have a question on the exam about this, and we've talked about the hypothalamus before in Chapter 2, but just knowing. Another interesting thing about the hypothalamus is its communication with the stomach, because the stomach, sends communication to the brain saying, hey, we're full, time to stop eating, time to not feel hungry, and there's a delay. And so a lot of times this is why it's recommended that you eat slowly. Not only is it good for your digestion, but it also gives your stomach a chance to communicate with the hypothalamus to let it know, when you're no longer hungry. But going into it, a national epidemic. Obesity. This is a huge issue. It's been a big issue for a while. It's only becoming a bigger issue. But it's not only a national epidemic, it's now global as well. So you see a lot of different countries out there that are having issues with obesity. And obviously there's a lot of health concerns. It affects us not only physically, but it also affects us psychologically. And then there's all sorts of other factors. Again, usually we talk about it in class, but, not just health, not just psychologically, but, it affects if you have children, because things like diabetes and stuff can become genetic, and that, of course, also has a link with obesity. There's stuff biologically as well. It's just not a good thing. And so there's all sorts of things that can cause obesity. A lot of times people think it's just, someone being lazy. And while that is one of the factors, that is not all of them. And so there are behavioral patterns. So not getting enough exercise, being a couch potato, or what we now call a cyber slug, if you're sitting on a computer or on the internet for a long time. Obviously what we eat is a factor. So if you're eating things that are really high in calories or high in fats, we're very highly processed, that's not good for us, and so it tends to stay on us. How much we're eating. So just as simple as, eating a lot and getting more weight, more likely to become obese. But this is where we then get into other things. So there's genetics and our metabolism. And this whole idea of, and this is something that you will need to know on the exam, a set point theory. So this is the whole idea that genetically speaking, we have this genetically predetermined level. So it says, when you're at 150 pounds, that's what your body is happy with. And so if you start to fall below that, it starts to hold on to more fat and stuff to get back up. If you start to get higher than that, then it does stuff to try to bring it back down. But there's this predetermined genetic level, and your body weight regulates around that. That is the set point theory. And what we see is it's different in everyone. So for some individuals, based upon genetics, family history, that set point is just a little bit higher. And so this is why you'll sometimes see people that, they work out, they eat healthy, and they do everything, but they still weigh a little bit more than other people. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're unhealthy. It just has to do with their genetics and what their body has decided is, this is the weight that, your body needs to have. There's also environmental factors. So, your access to what kind of food. One story that I always tell is I was a vegetarian for 6 years until I moved to Indiana. And again, it's nothing against Indiana, but where I ended up living, there were no grocery stores really that nearby, and so I didn't have a car at the time. The only place I could go was a convenience store, and their vegetarian options were limited. And so it changed my eating habits. And then there's also emotional cues. So there are a lot of individuals out there that, quote-unquote, eat their feelings. And so when they have a rough day or when they want to celebrate, they go to eating. And so, if that's your go-to for a lot of different emotions, that can also increase your chances of obesity. So what can we do to combat obesity? And this also goes into what you will need to know for the exam for the best weight loss techniques. So watching how much fat you eat. Again, a lot of times people think it's just, certain amount of calories, but it's not so much the amount of calories, but what kind of calories. Like, it's for most individuals, it's around 2,000 calories a day is what's recommended. But if you're eating 2,000 calories of junk food, that's not going to be as healthy as 200 calories worth of, fresh fruits and vegetables and meats and stuff like that. Controlling your portion size. So, especially in the US, what we consider a regular portion is greatly misconceived. You don't need as much as a lot of people think. So knowing those portion sizes, reading, like on the side of a box, it'll say how much a single serving is, and having that as a single serving if you are one individual. Another one is slowing down when you're eating, and this also relates to the next one. This is counting your bites. And again, this just gives your hypothalamus a chance to tell your body to slow down, or rather, I should say, it gives your stomach a chance to communicate with your hypothalamus so you don't overeat. Being aware of hidden calories, like those found in fruit drinks or processed food. If you actually look at a lot of fruit drinks out there, the majority of them do not have much fruit in them. They're mostly sugar that's artificially flavored to taste like fruit. So being aware of that, because that can have more calories than you would think. And trying to eat foods that are close to their natural state as possible, so not being as highly processed. And again, a lot of this, going back to environmental factors, sometimes you don't have as much access, but doing the best that you can. And then making physical activity a part of your lifestyle. So now we're going to go into some disorders. You might have heard of these before. They unfortunately affect a lot of individuals, especially in middle school, high school, kind of early adulthood. And the first one is what we call Anorexia Nervosa, which most people refer to as just plainly anorexia. And this is self-starvation resulting in an unhealthy and potentially dangerous low body weight. And for the sake of the exam, because this is something that you will need to know, it's focusing on this low body weight. So a dangerously low body weight is one of the classifications for anorexia nervosa. It's also characterized by an intense fear of becoming fat, or just you also have a distorted body image. So the way that you see yourself, this goes way back to when we were talking about sensation and perception. The way you perceive yourself is distorted, and this is difficult for a lot of people to understand. You will see yourself differently than how you actually look, because it affects your perception. And we know from optical illusions and stuff, sometimes we see things not the way they are. So it can also, for things that it can lead to cardiovascular problems. So a lot of times when people lose a lot of weight very suddenly for anorexia, the body fat that usually protects your organs disappears. And then, the muscle of your heart gets really, really weak. And so there are stories of individuals suffering from anorexia nervosa that, they go out to exercise and they just drop dead. So it is a very serious thing. There's also gastrointestinal problems, because a lot of times they're not eating the way that they should, and it causes a lot of problems with your digestive system. Loss of menstruation in females, because again, your body isn't getting enough nutrition that essentially the body feels like it can't survive, and so obviously, it wouldn't be able to sustain another life. And then also death by suicide or medical complications, because a lot of times individuals suffering from anorexia nervosa have some psychological issues going on as well. And one thing, because we're going to be talking about another psychological disorder, when looking at anorexia nervosa, a lot of times also you see this need for control. So a lot of times with individuals suffering from anorexia nervosa, there's this whole idea that they feel out of control in their life, like they don't have much control in what they are doing, and so the one thing that they can gain control over is their eating habits. And so a lot of times you'll see almost this kind of OCD-like behavior in how they eat, where it's very, very restricted, but also very, very strict. And so a lot of times you see this idea of control. And so you'll see with this one fashion model who died of anorexia nervosa, they said you feel as if you master everything, that you are in control, and then little by little you fall into the hellish spiral, a spiral of death. So again, you feel like you're in control until you realize, sometimes too late, that you are not. Another eating disorder is bulimia nervosa. And so this is a eating disorder categorized by what is sometimes seen as binging and purging. So binging is this action of just eating a ton, eating far more than the daily recommended amount, and then through doing so, wanting to get rid of everything that was consumed, and so through the use of laxatives, excessive exercising, self-induced vomiting, getting rid of that food. So that's why it's binging and purging. Usually individuals suffering from bulimia nervosa maintain a normal body weight, and this is because even if inducing vomiting, your body absorbs calories very, very quickly. And so, also, your body is very, very smart, and so if it realizes that, there's all this food coming in, but then it immediately goes back out, we need to hold on to as much as possible, it stores more as fat. And usually you'll see for those that suffer from bulimia nervosa, it comes in later in adolescence. So this can lead to things like potassium deficiencies, because you're not getting the proper vitamins and minerals and everything that you need. It can be esophageal damage, because again, especially if it's through self-induced vomiting, your stomach acid is constantly eroding at your throat and your esophagus. In a similar manner, there's decay of tooth enamel. Your teeth can start to rot, because again, they are getting exposed to stomach acid over and over again. And then, similar to anorexia nervosa, there is GI and cardiovascular disorder. When I talked about anorexia nervosa, I talked about how it is, a lot of times you see, psychologically speaking, this need for control. What you see for bulimia nervosa is kind of the opposite, where it's a feeling of no control at all. Where, an individual wants food and they completely lose control in themselves, they eat way too much, and then feel this overwhelming feeling of guilt afterwards, and then this need to try to get some control back and get rid of all that food that was consumed. So factors causing eating disorders, and there's a lot out there. So social pressure on women to achieve an unrealistic standard of thinness. There's going to be a video that goes with this module where you're going to be watching a video that shows how fashion magazines and displays and everything, just what it takes to get those images. But I can tell you right now, they are unrealistic. They are physically impossible for anyone to obtain. But a lot of people, especially younger individuals, don't realize that and feel like they need to look like that. Social media, which goes hand in hand with that. So comparing ourselves to others feeling really bad when we feel like we don't look like the way that, society wants us to look. With men, there's a pressure to maintain weight in a very narrow range due to sports. And so a lot of times when they think eating disorders, people think it only affects females, but that's not true. It also affects men as well. A need to look, muscular, to, have a lot of weight on you, or again, for certain sports, like in wrestling, you have to be within a very certain weight range, and so having that pressure as well. Also, there's negative emotions, or this feeling of perfectionism. And that goes back to what I was saying where, just wanting to have that control. And then there's also biological factors. So a hypothalamic disorder. So if you have hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, or other genetic things, or irregularities in serotonin, it affects your body. And sometimes you'll put on more weight than usual, and it has nothing to do with what you're eating or how much you're exercising. It's just genetic. But then it affects how a person feels. So all of these different factors are things that you will need to know for the exam. So again, issues of control or perfectionism. There's cultural pressures. That's another thing that kind of goes with the social pressures. So cultural pressures, negative emotions, and then kind of various disturbances, biologically speaking. There can also be disturbances in the brain. And all of those are factors. So then, just to review what we talked about hunger and the appetite, where it's the hypothalamus. We talked about obesity, how it's a huge issue, and there's all sorts of factors, but things that we can do. And I'll say right now, because I kind of glossed over it, but the best weight loss technique, here you go, if you want to lose weight, all those different things out there, the most effective thing is low-calorie, low-fat diet, with exercise. That's it. It takes longer than a lot of the other things out there, but it's the most effective. Low calorie, low fat diet with exercise. And then we talked about the two disorders, anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. So now we are going to very, very quickly talk about sexual motivation. Because since you guys are still in high school, there is some aspects of this that you do not need to know yet. And you can learn about in college. But what you will need to know are those two names, Masters and Johnson. And what you need to know about them is that they came up with the phases of the human sexual response cycle. So the sexual response cycle. So when you see Masters and Johnson, think sexual response cycle. And so it's a whole idea of there is excitement, the plateau, and the orgasm. Again, you have probably heard of this in your health class, and you will learn more in college, or ask your mom and dad. And then also resolution, which happens afterwards. And this is how it looks, or how it is perceived to look. This is the cycle for both men and women. So going through those things of excitement, plateau, orgasm, and then resolution. So just remembering that it's Masters and Johnson that do the sexual response cycle. If you want to know more, it's in the slides. And then the very last thing is this idea of sexual orientation. It used to be more of a thought of there are men and there are women, and that's it. Now we understand, and especially when it comes to our sexuality, that it's more on a continuum, where you can be very, very more of kind of the masculine, or more, interested in only the opposite sex, and that's it. There is homosexuality, where then it is interested in only the opposite sex. And then there's all sorts of stuff in the middle, where there is bisexuality, where it is both. There is pansexuality, where it is more for personality than going by the sex of the partner. There's all sorts of things out there, and I can probably not explain it in as much detail as, LGBT, such websites, though I believe it is now LGBTQ+. But the majority of Americans, and this was back in 2014, identify as heterosexual, according to the CDC survey. That has changed. But again, also there are also more emergences of different forms of sexual orientation. But what we have found through research is, again, this idea that it's more on a continuum than this whole idea of you are just one or the other. There's many different varieties. And that's it for modules 8.2 and 8.3. I know I went through kind of quickly in some of the subjects, and again, it's because you are learning this in high school, and there are certain restrictions to things that can be taught. So if you want to know more, ask your health teacher, or go to college. Or take a class in college, I should say. You guys are going to go to college. And so we're going to come back tomorrow to finish up Chapter 8 with 8.4.